What is the most precious resource in the universe? Is it gold or diamonds or other naturally occurring substances that have arbitrary value in the eyes of human beings? Or could the most precious thing be the diversity of life itself? We know of only one example of an ecosystem that exists on a thin layer on a single lonely planet. And life probably does exist elsewhere, but the genetic diversity of life on Earth is more precious to the survival of our species than every other resource combined. When a species goes extinct, the flame of a genetic lineage that spans back into time millions of years is extinguished. What happens when all the little flames of fragile life go out? This episode, we speak to Dr. Sarada Krishnan. She's the director of programs for the Crop Trust. It's an international nonprofit fighting to ensure the food and nutrition security of our civilization, and also dedicated to preserving the genetic diversity of plant life on our planet. They're responsible for the Svalbard Seed Bank. It's an incredible bunker. It's dug into the side of a mountain in one of the most inhospitably cold places on the planet. It exists for one reason: to house the seeds of plants in our ecosystem, to protect the genetic diversity at all cost, and when called upon, to bring a nearly extinct species back from being snuffed out forever. My name is Robert Roach. I'm joined in this episode by my co-host, co-founder, and the love of my life, Dr. Alexandra McCall-Garfinkel. This is the Type 1 Planet podcast. Watch or listen to this episode. Please subscribe. Share it with someone who might become inspired. And visit us at type1planet.net. Hello and welcome to the Type 1 Planet podcast. I'm Robert Roach. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Alexandra McCall-Garfinkel, and by our guest, Dr. Sarada Krishnan, director of the programs for Crop Trust, the international nonprofit dedicated to ensuring food and nutrition security on our planet. And Sarada, you're also responsible for some of the incredible projects, including some well-known ones. Some people may have heard of the Svalbard Seed Bank, which we'll be talking about a little bit. Dr. Krishnan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me as one of your guests at this in this exciting podcast.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit. So the podcast itself, we're looking to reimagine and hopefully spark a redesign of our civilization that can enter into a long-term sustainable state that's in equilibrium with our planetary environment. And a big part of this conversation is the preservation of arguably the most precious resource in the observable universe, which is genetic diversity on this planet. And so you can guess why we're so excited to talk to you. Let's start with a little bit of definitions that are central to the mission of your organization. What is crop diversity? Why is it important to the context of an everyday listener, the farmer, the scientific researcher?
Sure. Crop diversity, you can look at it in two ways. One is the diversity within each crop. So take wheat, for example. So within wheat, we have different varieties that we grow, but there are also these wild types of wheat that are very important for conservation with regards to building resilience in a wheat crop. And then there is also crop diversity in the sense of the diversity of crops that we can use as food. Because right now, if we are almost 60% of our global consumption comes from three crops: rice, maize, and wheat. But there are so many other crops which are very high in nutrition that are not consumed as widely. So that's why crop diversity, you have two different levels of diversity: just the larger biodiversity, agricultural biodiversity, and then within each crop, the diversity within each crop.
That's interesting. So is part of Crop Trust's approach, for example, looking at the different variations of wheat, for example, examining what are the strengths and weaknesses of this variation in comparison to the others? How many variations of wheat are there,
Yeah, there is. There are so many wheats, and then, what we call as crop wild relatives. These are the wild cousins of a crop. So what has happened is once we became a farming community 10, 12,000 years ago, all our crops have undergone domestication. They all used to be wild plants, and that was the birth of agriculture. through domestication. And so that is the farmers in those days kept selecting traits that were very beneficial to them, like larger grains or non-shattering grains and all of that. So over time, it is through domestication that we have had the crops that we have now. And so with that domestication, what has happened is there has been this narrowing of the gene pool of our crops, which means a lot of the genes that were in the wild at one point have been lost in cultivation. And with that, we have lost some of those adaptive traits for change in environment. So that is why we look at the entire diversity of all the crops to ensure that they are conserved for our future, because we are not sure what climate is going to bring to us. So we really need these adaptive potential from all of these wild species and cultivars that we really need to tap into for future resilience.
Sarada, that brings up something so interesting to me. Having listened to other interviews you've done and read, a bunch of literature that's available around what you do. Really, in the relationship between crop diversity at the level of each crop and across crops, with broader biodiversity, right, of the planet, and how that relationship functions, and really how you think about that relationship. Clearly, the wild type cousins is a bridge in some ways between crop diversity and broader biodiversity. But is there other parts of that relationship that you think about or that come up when you kind of problem solve around this?
When we talk about from our mandate, it is the crop diversity that we protect. But in the big scheme of things, overall biodiversity conservation is so important because it's the soil microorganisms. From a farmer's perspective, if you want a higher yield or nutritious thing, you have to have pollinators. You have to have microbes that contribute to the health of the plant. So we really need to look at the entire biodiversity while we are conserving crop diversity as well.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And then, in thinking about in the current crisis of biodiversity, as we move forward as an agricultural society, do you see, and I think we'll get into this even more later in detail, do you see redesigns in how we do agriculture and, crop diversity maintenance that could help us sustain agriculture as a part of our functioning society for longer?
Yeah, I think over time, due to industrialization, we have gotten into monocropping. And, monocropping is advantageous for big, large acreage of farms where you have labor shortages and then you need to harvest by machines. So monocropping is very useful for that. But by monocropping, we are also not only losing the diversity, but also if pest or disease epidemic happens, then you're wiping out the entire crop is wiped. And so the farmer does not get any revenue from the crop because everything is gone. So that's why, you need to look at with tree crops and all of that, you talk about agroforestry systems. Like I'm a coffee scientist and a coffee expert. And so in coffee, you look at agroforestry systems. So that way you're looking at multiple levels of cropping. So in addition to coffee, you have bananas or you have other tree crops that you can get a revenue from. And so those are ways that you need to think about in your systems, is looking at just instead of just one variety in 100-acre parcels, looking at including include fruits and vegetables within your cropping systems.
It really seems like the current agricultural systems, if you place it inside of a totally self-serving capitalistic system, you're going to trend toward monocrop agriculture because you don't need to invest that much more into the kinds of machines and seeds and that kind of stuff that you're investing in. Are there examples that you're aware of where the system works on a capitalistic way to have a more diverse biome in your agricultural system? Are there farms or places where it's working and people are making money by having a more diverse system that they're working with?
I have mostly, it is with our staple, the grain crops, that I see more of these monoculture. Whereas when you go to a vegetable farm or somebody who's growing vegetables, you can see a much more diverse crops being grown by the farmer. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I've seen any. With the coffee as an example, like I mentioned, the agroforestry system, like having bananas with your coffee, it's useful to, that's another crop that you have when coffee is not producing. And cocoa also, having multiple crops along with your cocoa. So other than that, I can't think of any other examples. But, also doing different varieties, not even if you're doing just wheat, just don't do one variety. Do parcels with multiple varieties. So that way, if one is resistant to a disease and one is not, at least one, you can save one when a disease comes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from what I've heard you talk about in the past, actually, diversity in your crops at a species and systems level in itself is fundamentally more beneficial on both a biological scale and capitalistic scale. You're able to not only, like you said, especially with something like coffee that takes so long to set up, which I only know because of you, to then have other, something else that you're able to gather in the meantime, or even right within variations to avoid wiping out of all crops because of disease. All of that actually safeguards you financially in a way that if you're hyper monoculturing, you're not going to get. So that I think that's super important to remember for arguments against monoculturing, for sure.
Yeah, and also having some of those tree species or that were nitrogen fixing, that fix nitrogen in the soil, adding natural fertilizer to the plants is also very important. And that's why a lot of times they do the rotational crops, and even in big fields, you want to do rotation where you do a legume over the fallow season or whatever, so that way you can add fertilizer back to the soil in a natural way.
So monocrop agriculture is really only one of these primary threats to crop diversity. And your website does an amazing job of laying out and clearly explaining all of the different ways that crop diversity is threatened. So I advise everyone head over to the Crop Trust website. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other examples? For example, genetic erosion, pests and diseases. What else is happening out there that we need to be worried about?
So I'm going to give you an example of, this is a wheat variety that was just Lucy. There was an article maybe about 3 weeks ago in The Guardian. It's called the Jabal wheat. And that is a durum wheat that was developed through one of our Crop Wild Relatives programs. So there was a wild cousin of a cultivated durum wheat from Syria that was collected 20 or 30 years ago. And it was used in a breeding program to breed with cultivated durum wheat to develop drought tolerance. And it was just released in Morocco early this year. It was certified in Morocco and released to the farmers. And when the variety was developed, the past 3 or 4 years, they did farmer trials in Morocco using the farmers, because you need to have farmers participate in this, because if the farmers are not part of those selection and decision-making process, the adoption will be very low. So farmers were part of this participatory process. And during the trials, serendipitously, it happened to be drought years. So in a field trial, when you have your new variety along with other varieties of wheat, when everything else failed, this Jabal wheat was the only one that survived the drought years, with high yield as well. So that went to prove the resilience of climate resilience of this wheat variety using a gene adapted, incorporated from wild species of wheat. So that is one of those examples that I can say. And there was also this year a potato variety called metalled potato was released in Peru using the same, and it is one of those early blight resistant varieties that has now been released to farmers.
That's amazing. How widespread is when you say released, what percentage of the farmers? Is it a very small sample population and then it's going to be scaled, or how's it going to
It has to be scaled because, seed production has to take on. So initially when it starts, it is on a small scale. But, once farmers are adopting it, then the wide scale seed production. So in any kind of new variety release, you need to work with the private sector too to develop the seed industry, because if you don't have a seed system in place, then a new variety is not going to get to the farmers.
Well, so that's fascinating. So it's a private organization that actually developed this seed. It's not a...
Oh, no. This is through the international... ICARDA is the International Crop Research Center for Dryland Agriculture, ICARDA. And so it is one of the CG centers that we fund through our endowment fund. One of the gene banks. So it came from that international ICARDA gene bank through research programs in the gene bank.
Interesting. And so did they isolate? Do you have any information on how they actually created this variation, or is it?
The breeding is through crossing, traditional crossing.
Okay. Great.
So traditional, you cross and then you back cross. That's why it takes many years sometimes to do these breeding programs.
So that's so interesting to me as someone who uses CRISPR every day. I have, for that reason, a certain bias around the GMO conversation, very much, specifically on the fact that genetic modification itself is not actually going to harm you as a person when it comes to your crops. But obviously there is this problem with monoculturing and with the relationship between plants. So all of that being very real. But do you see, traditional breeding is incredible. And obviously in some ways, because it's artificial selection, it's closer to natural selection than just, specific gene editing. Is there a reason you think that is that why you would maintain artificial selection through breeding rather than potentially doing, gene transfer from some species to others? And if, no worries if this is out of your wheelhouse or anything, because it's...
No, because GMO is very, very controversial subject and very polarizing, and especially through an international organization. If you want adoption, especially since many countries already have policies against use of GMO crops, then you really need to be. If you want something to reach the farmers, I think the traditional, even though the GMO and traditional might lead to the same outcome, I think for the sake of policies and for us, the benefit is for the farmers. We really need to ensure that farmers are are being provided with the tools that they need to cope with climate change. So for that, you really need to consider those. What you might have been able to do faster with a genetic engineering perspective, you're probably a little slower. But so those are, I think it'll have to be a shift in thinking that that has to come through because of how much time it takes in a traditional breeding, which can be done faster through modern technologies. I think the way the climate change is going, the plants can't adapt as fast. So we may have to revert to some of these modern technologies, but I don't think we are there yet because of the restrictive governmental policies.
So on the spectrum of threats to crop diversity, there's the more cataclysmic side of things where you can see, potentially entire populations dying out. And that's where I think we're not necessarily only where these come into play, but a big part of where these come into play are these gene banks and that you mentioned earlier. And you mentioned that the Crop Trust is responsible for a gene bank partnership that's worldwide. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is a gene bank? The physical location, what are they attempting to do, and what is it on a worldwide scale?
Sure. So gene banks are where you store crop diversity in kind of in perpetuity and hopefully. And so there are seed banks where you conserve crops that can be conserved as seeds. You store those seeds in long-term storage and put them in a freezer and store them, or even in cryopreservation. And for plants that are clonally propagated, like coffee cannot be stored as seeds, or sweet potato or cassava cannot be stored as seeds. Those are clonally propagated crops. Then you have what you call field gene banks. So where it would be like in a farm that you're cultivating all of these different crop diversity, multiple plants with various genotypes in a field. So the seeds are much easier because seeds don't take as much time, as much resources as a field gene bank. So, so there are 11 international gene banks. They're called the CGIAR system, and they were established, maybe about 50 or 60 years ago by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And there are the 11 gene banks, and ICARDA I mentioned earlier, it was actually originally in Syria. And then when the civil war happened, it was moved to Morocco and Lebanon. And so about 20 years ago, through the Global Crop Diversity Trust and not 20 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, the Global Crop Diversity Trust, the Norwegian government, and the Nordic gene banks called Nordgen, and the Crop Trust partnered in developing the global seed vault, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is in the Arctic, in the permafrost. And so one of the things with these seed gene banks is not only do they store it there, they also need to ensure that those seeds are safely duplicated in at least 2 other sites, maybe within their own country or in a different country or in a backup storage. And so that's what the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is, a backup storage facility. So in case something happened, like as example is that Syrian gene bank that I talked about, the ICARDA gene bank in Syria, that whole thing was destroyed during the civil war. And fortunately, they had backed up all the seeds in the global seed vault in Svalbard, that they were able to retrieve those seeds and establish the 2 gene banks in Lebanon and Morocco. And then they were able to regenerate all those seeds and put it back into the seed vault again. So those are that is the entire reason why the Svalbard Global Seed Vault was developed, so that way we don't lose our collections because a country can go through civil war or a hurricane or some climate fire, something happens. So you really want to, so that's what these gene banks are for, is to protect our crop diversity. So there is the International Rice Research Institute in Philippines, Manila, in Los Baños, Philippines. And their focus is all the rice genetic resources that they conserve. And then ICARDA is all the dryland crops. And then there is the CIAT in Cali, Colombia, a lot of tropical forages and beans and cassava. So all of these have their own special mandate of what crops they conserve. So that way, almost the entire food crop systems are conserved. And then there are also national gene banks. Every country has their own national gene bank. So a lot of those locally indigenous vegetables or fruits or food crops that they use are conserved in those national gene banks.
There's a really interesting aspect to the Svalbard Seed Bank. It's not just a doorway into the ground. It's an incredibly beautiful building. It looks like a portal, like heading into another world. And from that perspective, there's an artistic message in that building. And just wondering if you could speak a little bit to it. Why did they put so much effort into making it such an incredible site?
I think once you go inside, it's just a vault. I have not been there yet, but I'm not sure on the history. I think Carrie Fowler had the book Seeds on Ice. I think that might be a good reference on the architecture of the Global Seed Vault that I would recommend any of your viewers or listeners to look into.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll link that in the show notes.
I have a quick question about the Svalbard Seed Bank as well. So listening to you talk about it and reading about it, I was really interested to know how many countries actually have used the Svalbard Seed Bank as a backup. Is it every country? Is it, a certain subset, or is it, really diverse and more random?
I think there are 80 or 90 countries that have backed up their seeds in there.
Wow.
And the thing is, the seeds that are backed up there belongs to the country. It is not distributed. Nothing is distributed from there. And the Syrian one was just, that was just an anomaly, because typically you do not take the seeds out of there. It is kept there for perpetuity. And so all countries have the option to come and store their seeds there as a backup option. So many countries, I think it is, I think 80 or 90 countries already have. Maybe it might be more than that.
Wow.
How do we, is the objective to get as many countries as possible, or are you being strategic with the countries and organizations that you reach out to?
I think we want as many countries. And now that we have a project called Bold Biodiversity for Opportunities and Livelihoods and Development. And there we are working with national gene banks. And one of the work packages under that is backing up seeds at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And so we are working with 45 national gene banks that have that. And so for regenerating high quality seeds, you have to go through a whole multiplication and regeneration and multiplication process. So we are providing funds as part of this project to these 45 national gene banks to regenerate their crops and to back them up at Svalbard. So because we want to ensure that at least this germination, the viability is high, because you don't want low quality seeds going there, because if they're already low quality, they may not survive 100 or 200 or 300 years. So, yeah.
Okay.
So we want as many countries as possible to deposit the seeds in Svalbard.
Got it. And does a country's membership, is that what's producing at least a portion or all of your funding? Are they kind of contributing financially, or how does the funding work?
Oh, no, this is our Bold project is Norwegian government funding. So the Bold project is, we are working with, there are different work packages. The work package one is building capacity of gene banks of 15 national gene banks. So we did an assessment this year, and next year we'll be doing a training and capacity building exercises and maybe some infrastructure advancement for them. And then work package 2 is developing, work package 2 is pre-breeding. Pre-breeding is using crop wild relatives from a crop wild relatives project, which was the past 10 years. Incorporating them, we are looking at 4 or 5 crops and using those wild relatives into breeding programs and developing resilient varieties as pre-breeding material so that breeders can use it. And then work package 3 is developing seed systems. So not only are you building those pre-breeding material, but if you come up with a variety, you need to have a seed system in place to distribute them to farmers. And then work package 4 is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And our work package 5 is communications, because, all of it, and if we don't communicate these stories to the public, nobody knows about them. So we really want to make sure that people understand what crop diversity is, why it's important, and convey this to communicate it to the public, and also build capacity of all our partners in communicating, because they need to communicate to the government of the value of the gene bank, so that way they can get their own funding for their collections.
Thank you so much for that. That was such a great explanation. And following up with that, food diversity, these are the universal needs of humanity, right? Some of our fundamental needs. Do you think it would be possible to achieve integration of 100% of countries on Earth to participate in the Global Gene Bank Partnership? Theoretically, and what are barriers now that you see that may be preventing that?
Gene bank is, I think a lot of the countries are resource poor countries. And, collecting and saving seeds needs a lot of resources. And not only do you have to collect, and then you have to do viability. And the thing is, seeds cannot be, you put the seeds in storage, but every few years you have to take them out, test for viability. And if the viability goes below a certain percentage, you have to take it to the field and regenerate them. And if it is cross-pollinating, you have to ensure that they do not cross-pollinate. So you are keeping them true to type. And then you have to regenerate those seeds and then test viability and put them back into storage. So it's a cycle. It's the work of a gene bank is never done because you need to monitor and evaluate your seed collections and have a plan on constant regeneration. So it is time and also equipment. You need to have cold storage, and a lot of the countries have problems with electricity. So if you put it in a cold storage like a freezer, and the electricity, I mean, we were in a country recently where when we were there, the power went off and they have a backup generator and the generator failed. And so a lot of the countries have challenges in developing countries. So it is hard unless you provide them with resources. It's easy for us to tell every country has to, every gene bank put your backup in Svalbard, but unless you provide them with resources, it's hard. And that's why the Bold Work Package 4 enables them to do that.
Yeah, those work packages sound really, really imperative for that kind of inclusivity. Absolutely.
From a storytelling perspective, I think that's a big part of why we're doing this, is trying to relay the big ideas to the viewers and listeners, and also to people who have similar missions in preserving, the future of our civilization, but a totally different approach. So let's just talk about crop diversity, which might not be something that has crossed their minds. What does a potential future without genetic safeguards to our crop diversity look like? What are the real risks that we're facing as a species?
So we are so used to, we go to the grocery store and we want to see all the different crops and have those choices. And if there was no crop diversity, we will just have one type of apple, or one type of beans, or one type of something. And that too, like right now, look at banana. Banana, what is that Panama disease or whatever that banana has, that we have been relying on that Cavendish banana. But if you go to Asia, Southeast Asia, there is so much banana diversity. So I come originally from India, and the banana diversity there is incredible. But in the Western world, we just get one type of banana. And that banana is now threatened with a disease, with a fungal disease. And so that our breakfast is gone in the Western world. So that is the type of thing that, if you lost diversity, you are even like the banana could be gone. Or coffee. An example is coffee, because coffee has very low genetic diversity because of the way it has been domesticated and spread around the world, as well as the crop, the biological nature of the crop, which is a tetraploid itself. Coffee has, the Arabica coffee has very low genetic diversity. And that's why it's very prone to pests and diseases. And I don't know if you've heard about the 2012, 2013, there was the coffee leaf rust epidemic in the Central America. And it wiped out all the coffee in that region, Honduras, El Salvador, so that's the thing, is if there was no diversity that would help combat this disease, then coffee is a crop that'll be gone. And also climate change has huge impacts on coffee too, because they have a very small climate envelope that they can survive in. And with warming, then that's when you get higher pests and disease incidences. And and we are all addicted to caffeine. And if we don't have our caffeine, without coffee, I don't know what we'll be as a society.
Yeah, I think pre-Renaissance, we were all just drinking beer, and it was a little more hectic back then. So,
slightly fewer, societal and mathematic and scientific revelations happening with beer instead of coffee.
Yeah.
Not that they can't both have their uses.
Yeah. And then, in a places where, where there is famine, it leads to conflicts. And I mean, it can have geopolitical implications with the loss of diversity and with the loss of resilience to climate change. A lot of places, famine is a reality.
And have we seen any examples of go ahead, Ali.
No, it's okay. Yep. I think you're going to ask what I was going to
ask. All right. Have we seen any examples of famine occurring because of lack of crop diversity where we can point at a time in history where because of a disease, there was for example, a crop disease, we lost a large population of people?
Oh, yes. That's the Irish potato famine. That is the perfect example of that early blight of potato. And what was in the 1940s? When was the Irish 1840s? When was the Irish potato blight? So that was when in Ireland, the potato blight wiped out all the potato, and a lot of people died, and a lot of people migrated to the United States. That's one perfect example.
Great. Let's just talk a little bit about with an unlimited budget. I want you to think big here for a second about the Crop Trust in general. How do the initiatives of the Crop Trust evolve if you had an unlimited budget? What does your organization hope to achieve in the next 100 years? Like the big picture dreams of this organization?
Ensure all crop diversity is protected. So for us, I think right now we have our mandate, the way we operate is through an endowment fund. And so we currently have about $250 million in an endowment, which helps to fund the International Gene Bank. So we have international gene banks. Those are the 11 centers I talked about, the CG centers. And if we had, and our goal is to raise our endowment fund to $800 million. And if we got $800 million, that will allow us to also support national gene banks. So what would be if we had more money than that? I think supporting all the national gene banks, because the national gene banks is where all of those local diversity will be conserved, which are not conserved in the international gene banks. Locally, a lot of the indigenous vegetables, it'll never become a global crop, but it is very valuable, culturally valuable, nutritionally valuable to the local population. So having those conserved is so important. So that's where I think if we had all the money in the world, that's what we will do is, ensure that the entire global diversity is protected.
So what needs to happen next, to continue building this organization? Who would you want to sit down with at a table, a person, an organization, to talk about these ideas, to enforce the importance of these concepts of crop diversity? Who are some people that you would want to talk to?
Sure, all the high net worth individuals, who can support, because this conserving crop diversity is so important. And we've had Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funding for projects before, but a larger amount to our endowment fund, the Jeff Bezos fund, or the Howard Buffett fund. So I think it'll be great to get all of those large foundations and organizations committing to protecting crop diversity and supporting us through our endowment fund, so that way we can protect crop diversity globally.
Well, Dr. Krishnan, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. This is amazing. Hopefully it's just the beginning of a longer conversation about getting the word out on crop diversity, on what the Crop Trust is doing, on the seed banks. And you're clearly an excellent spokesperson for the cause. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to present our organization and the work that we do.
It's a pleasure.